Scientists found a fish with a wrist. Read that sentence again. A fish with a functioning wrist buried in 375 million-year-old rock. This fossil, named Tiktaalik, wasn't just a biological curiosity. It was a snapshot of a distant ancestor, caught in a moment of terrible decision. To understand that decision, you have to understand the world it lived in, a world that was completely alien. The land is silent, empty, a green continent waiting for a conqueror. But the water is a war zone. For over 100 million years, fish have been locked in an evolutionary arms race, and you are on the losing side. You are a small, soft-bodied creature in a world of monsters. Giants like Dunkleosteus, an armored predator the size of a bus, patrol these waters. Its jaw could snap an early shark in half, and you are on its menu. Every shadow could be death. Every day is a fight to simply not be eaten. But then you see it. The shore. The land. It's empty. No giant armored fish. No competition. It's a paradise of untouched resources, an entire world for the taking. So, why didn't everyone just crawl out? Because the space between the water and the land was a kill zone. A few meters of mud and sand that was more dangerous than the entire ocean. Think about what that first move would feel like. You push yourself onto the mudflat. For the first time, you feel the full, crushing force of gravity on your body. Your delicate gills, so perfect for water, begin to dry and stick together, flapping uselessly in the alien air. You can't breathe. You are awkward, exposed, a perfect meal for a predator lunging from the shallows, or for the giant arthropods that already patrol the shoreline. You've escaped one trap only to stumble into another. The history books call these creatures pioneers. They celebrate the opportunity, the expansion into a new world, but they rarely mention the cost. For every one creature that made it, how many thousands were left gasping on the mud, their bones washed away by the next tide, their attempt completely forgotten? It was the ultimate paradox. Stay in the water, and you face near-certain death from predators. Try to leave, and you face near-certain death from physics, exposure, and a new set of hunters. It's a perfect stalemate. And yet, you are here. Life is here. So if moving was suicide, and staying was suicide, what impossible force was strong enough to push our ancestors across that line? It was a gradual, desperate crawl, driven by a relentless, crushing pressure. You see, the ocean itself was changing. The very environment that had cradled life for eons began to betray it. About 380 million years ago, during the late Devonian period, global sea levels started to drop dramatically. What do you think happens when the water disappears? The vast open seas began to fragment. Inland lakes and shallow coastal areas became isolated. Think of it like a shrinking prison. The walls close in. Competition for food intensifies. Oxygen levels in these dwindling pools plummeted, making every breath a struggle. This wasn't a choice anymore. It was survival. Dr. Jennifer Clack, a paleontologist at the University of Cambridge, spent decades studying these ancient transitions. Her work on fossil sites in Greenland, particularly around the 1980s and 1990s, revealed something critical. She found specimens like Acanthostega, an early tetrapod, with fully formed limbs and digits, yet its skeleton suggested it was still primarily aquatic. It had lungs, yes, but also gills. It was a creature caught between two worlds, perfectly illustrating the dilemma. It was a transitional form, a living paradox. But here's the part nobody talks about. The first creatures to venture onto land weren't doing it because it was easy. They were doing it because staying in the water meant certain death. It was the lesser of two evils. Imagine the terror. Every instinct screams at you to stay in the water, a place of relative safety, a place you understand. Yet the water itself is killing you. The oxygen is gone, the food is scarce, and the predators, though fewer, are now trapped with you in an ever-shrinking space. So you push, you strain. Your protolimbs, once mere fins, scrape against the mud. This isn't exploration. This is an escape. A desperate, agonizing escape. The official narrative often paints these pioneers as bold adventurers, eager to conquer new frontiers. But the evidence suggests a different story. These were not conquerors. These were refugees. They were the ones who couldn't compete in the increasingly hostile aquatic environment. The weakest, the most desperate. What do you think happened to the strong? They stayed in the water. They thrived, for a time, in the deeper, more stable environments. But the ones who moved, the ones who dared to gasp for air on land, they were the ones who truly survived. They carried the genetic blueprint for a new way of life. The earliest tracks, like those found at the Zakolmy Quarry in Poland, date back 395 million years. These tracks, discovered in 2010 by Grzegorz Nedwecki, show distinct digits, clear evidence of walking. This discovery pushed back the timeline of land colonization by almost 10 million years, challenging previous assumptions that Tiktaalik was the first. These were not fish-like creatures flopping. These were creatures walking. But walking where? Onto what? Into a world completely devoid of familiar food sources. There were no plants with edible leaves, no insects to feast upon. The first land plants were small, moss-like forms, barely clinging to the damp soil. What sustained these first pioneers? Scientists now believe they were scavenging. Dead fish washed ashore from the dying pools, decaying algae, anything. It was a brutal existence. The cost of this pioneering spirit was immense. For every successful step, there were countless failures. Bones broken, bodies desiccated. An agonizing death under the harsh Devonian sun. This wasn't a gentle transition. It was an evolutionary bottleneck, a trial by fire. And here's where it gets surprising. The creatures that made it weren't necessarily the biggest or the strongest. They were the most adaptable. The ones with the slight anatomical variations that allowed for just a few more agonizing inches of movement on land. The ones who could hold their breath a little longer. The ones who could tolerate the searing sun for a few minutes more. It wasn't about being first. It was about being last. Last to die in the water, and first to survive on land. But even then, the struggle was far from over. Because once you were on land, what then? Where did you find water? How did you reproduce? And what new, unseen horrors awaited you in this seemingly empty world? Where did you find water? How did you reproduce? And what new, unseen horrors awaited you in this seemingly empty world? The answers were not simple. They were brutal. One of the most immediate challenges on land was desiccation. Your body, evolved for water, was now constantly losing moisture to the dry Devonian air. Think about what that means. Every second you spent out of the water was a battle against drying out, against your cells shriveling. It was a race against time, a constant thirst. Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, the renowned paleontologist, often spoke about the contingency of evolution. That tiny, seemingly insignificant variations could have profound impacts. For these early tetrapods, a slightly thicker skin, a more efficient kidney, or even a behavioral adaptation like seeking shade, could mean the difference between life and death. You needed to find water, not just to drink, but to protect your vulnerable eggs. Reproduction, a simple matter of releasing gametes into the vast ocean, became an impossible task on land. The eggs would dry out, the sperm would die. So what did they do? The earliest land vertebrates, the amphibians, solved this by returning to water to breed. A temporary reprieve, a desperate compromise. Imagine the journey. You fought to gain a foothold on land, only to be forced back to the very environment you fled just to continue your lineage. It's an exhausting cycle, a constant back and forth. But here's the twist. The land wasn't as empty as it first appeared. For millions of years before any vertebrate dared to crawl ashore, arthropods had already colonized the terrestrial environment. Millipedes, centipedes, spiders, and early insects thrived, feasting on the pioneering land plants. These creatures were small, yes, but they were numerous. They were adapted, and they were hungry. For our first land dweller, this empty paradise was suddenly filled with new predators, small, fast, and completely alien. You've traded the giant fish for swarms of crawling, biting things. The fossil record of the Rhynie chert, a Scottish site dating back 407 million years, gives us an incredible snapshot of this early terrestrial ecosystem. It shows a complex web of life, small plants, fungi, and a surprising diversity of arthropods. This was the world waiting for our ancestors. This was the new sniper's game. Every rock could hide a scorpion, every patch of moss a waiting centipede. The official narrative often overlooks these smaller, earlier colonizers. It focuses on the grand transition of vertebrates. But these arthropods were the true pioneers. They laid the groundwork. They created the first food chains on land. What happens when a desperate, clumsy refugee stumbles into a world already owned by agile, well-adapted natives? A brutal clash. A new evolutionary pressure. The creatures that survived had to develop new defenses, tougher skin, faster reflexes, or, perhaps most importantly, the ability to breathe more efficiently. The air, while abundant in oxygen, was also a challenge. Gills were useless. Lungs were primitive. The earliest lungs were essentially modified swim bladders, simple sacs for gas exchange. They were not efficient. You were still gasping, still struggling for every breath. Dr. Jenny Clack's research further illuminates this. Her analyses of early tetrapod skulls, particularly the arrangement of their eyes on top of their heads, suggest they spent a lot of time at the water's edge, looking up, waiting, watching. For what? For opportunity, for prey, or perhaps for danger. This wasn't a world of open plains. It was a world of dense, low-lying vegetation and muddy banks. A world of ambush. A world where you had to be constantly vigilant. And here's the part that few consider: the psychological toll. Imagine the constant fear, the relentless pressure. Every decision, a life or death gamble. Stay in the water and you drown. Go on land and you desiccate or are eaten by something you've never encountered before. It's a no-win scenario, yet life persisted. It's a testament to the sheer, unyielding drive of evolution. A drive that pushes organisms to endure unimaginable hardships, to adapt to impossible conditions. But even with all these challenges, one question remains. How did they break free from the water's edge entirely? How did they finally sever that last, desperate link to their aquatic past and truly conquer the land? The answer lies not in a single heroic leap, but in a series of tiny, almost imperceptible changes. Changes that would eventually allow them to leave the water behind forever. The irony is profound. The very act of escaping one threat led them directly into another, more complex and equally deadly game. A game of survival played out in the mud, under the harsh sun, surrounded by unseen foes. And you were just trying to breathe. For moisture, for survival against unseen foes, defined the lives of those early pioneers. Imagine the sound of your own labored breathing, the grit of mud under your belly, the constant, burning ache of dry skin. We often discuss evolution in grand terms, as a sweeping narrative of progress. But for the individual, it was a deeply personal, terrifying ordeal. Think about the sheer terror of it. Every day was a fight against desiccation. Dr. Emily Rayfield, a biomechanist at the University of Bristol, has studied the bone structure of early tetrapods. Her research, published in the early 2000s, indicates that their skeletons were still largely unsuited for full terrestrial locomotion. They were built for pushing through mud, not for sustained walking. This means every movement on land was an extreme effort, demanding immense energy. You were an engine running on fumes. And here's where it gets heartbreaking. For every creature that managed to drag itself a few meters further inland, how many others simply failed? Their bodies, small and fragile, left to bake in the sun. The fossil record, by its very nature, only preserves the successes. It tells us nothing of the countless failures, the quiet deaths of those who couldn't make it. Nobody talks about the ones who tried and lost. You see the footprints in the ancient mud, clear evidence of a creature walking. But what about the ones that didn't leave footprints? The ones that simply collapsed, their strength giving out before they could make their mark. These were not just biological specimens, these were individuals, each with the instinct to survive, each facing an impossible choice. What do you think that felt like? To push yourself to the absolute limit, only to find that the land offered no mercy. The official narrative focuses on the survival of the fittest, but perhaps it was the survival of the most desperate, or simply the luckiest. Scientists now believe that the earliest lung-breathing fish, and later the tetrapods, were not just seeking food on land. They were seeking refuge. Periods of drought, common in the Devonian, would have created vast, inhospitable mudflats. The water they knew was gone. This wasn't a choice to explore. It was a choice to not die in a drying puddle. Imagine the sensation of the sun beating down, the mud cracking around you, the desperate search for any damp patch, any shade. Your gills, designed for water, now just painful membranes. Your eyes, accustomed to the murky depths, now squinting against the harsh light. Dr. Jennifer Clack's analysis of the eye placement in early tetrapods, positioned high on their skulls, suggests they were constantly looking upwards or forwards out of the water. They were scanning for danger, or perhaps for hope, for a new, wetter patch of ground. It was a constant state of vigilance. This wasn't a world of open plains. It was a world of dense, low-lying vegetation and muddy banks. A world of ambush. A world where you had to be constantly vigilant. The psychological toll must have been immense. Every rustle in the primitive vegetation, every shadow, could mean a new predator. The arthropods, already well established, were a constant, unseen threat. You had traded one set of monsters for another, smaller, faster, and just as deadly. For millions of years, this tightrope walk continued. The creatures that made it weren't necessarily the biggest or the strongest. They were the ones with the slight anatomical variations that allowed for just a few more agonizing inches of movement on land. The ones who could hold their breath a little longer. The ones who could tolerate the searing sun for a few minutes more. It wasn't about being first, it was about being last. Last to die in the water, and first to survive on land. But even then, the struggle was far from over. Because once you were on land, what then? Where did you find water? How did you reproduce? And what new, unseen horrors awaited you in this seemingly empty world? This wasn't just a biological transition. It was a story of endless, agonizing choices. And you were living every single one of them, with every labored breath. And with each of those breaths, something changed, not just in you, but in the fabric of life itself. The stalemate was finally broken by an invention of profound elegance, the amniotic egg. Appearing in the fossil record around 312 million years ago, this wasn't just a better shell. It was a private ocean, a self-contained world with its own water supply, its own food source, and its own waste sack. Think about what that means. You no longer had to return to the water to breed. The last chain was broken. You could finally turn your back on the place you fled and never look back. The official records call this moment a triumph, the final conquest of the land. Reptiles, freed from the water's edge, spread across the continents. They diversified into the dinosaurs, the birds, the mammals, into us. But nobody asks what was lost in that moment of victory. We celebrate the escape. We rarely question the prison we built for ourselves in the process. You traded a world of 3 dimensions for a world of 2, a world of floating for a world of falling. The evidence of this ancient trade-off is written into your own body today. Your constant thirst, the way your bones ache under the pull of gravity. The memory of water is etched into your very cells. Every human embryo still develops in a saline sac, a tiny, personal ocean. For 9 months, you are a marine creature once more. We see the hesitation of that first step everywhere. In the company that waits for a competitor to test a new market. In the scientist who waits for more data before publishing a radical theory. In the crowd where no one is the first to speak up. The fear is the same. The fear of being exposed. The fear of failure. The fear of the unknown kill zone between what is and what could be. The first one out is the most vulnerable. They absorb the cost. They pay the price. And those who follow walk on the trail they blazed. We are the children of the desperate, the refugees, the ones who were pushed from the water because they could not thrive there. We carry the legacy of their fear, but also their impossible endurance. So the next time you stand at a crossroads, the next time you feel the immense weight of a first step, the primal fear of leaving the familiar behind, remember that 375-million-year-old choice. Remember the mud and the sun and the cost of that first searing breath.